Hello, this is a recording mainly for the Suffolk Jungian group and our meeting at the end of August, where we're going to be discussing the archetype of the Dark Mother. But it may, of course, as I always say in these recordings in months past, may also be of interest to people who are not members of the Suffolk Jungian group but have an interest in Jung or some of the related issues that get spoken about. So by all means, listen in and perhaps add a comment and your own thoughts and feelings and experiences, reflections on these issues. Now, the Dark Mother, short version thereof, is that Jung argues every archetype has a good side and a bad side, a sort of a positive and a negative. Whether it's good and bad in a moralistic sense, that is perhaps a little debatable. Certainly a lot of cultures, a lot of individuals do see this as a decidedly moral issue, that there is a sort of good angle and an evil angle. Others perhaps aiming for, what should we say, a bit more of a secular approach, a bit more of a neutral approach, have suggested that there are sort of comfortable and uncomfortable bits. Parts of an archetype that are kind of pleasant to be around and experience and find within yourself or find within other people, and there are other parts which for a variety of reasons are uncomfortable and unpleasant and difficult and challenging to find in yourself or experience in other people. So obviously leave it to you, the listener, to decide for yourself whether you would take a moral approach to this, or you'd see it as a more kind of comfort versus discomfort issue. I suspect the truth is a combination of both. For the vast majority of people, that there are things which can be uncomfortable without necessarily being evil, but there are also things which are decidedly nasty and unpleasant, and not to be kind of condoned or encouraged or whatever. So the father archetype has a positive and a negative, and the mother archetype has a positive and a negative, and I'm sure in some future recording we'll talk about the father archetype, but for now we'll focus on the mother one. So the positives of the mother archetype: loving, nurturing, sustaining of life, being the sort of the heart and soul of the family, bringing people together, and that's both family in the usual blood relatives sense, but it's also understood as being what sociologists these days refer to as fictive family. That's to say, people you're not actually biologically related to, but you treat them as if they were your brother, sister, child, parent, aunt, uncle, granny, whoever. They kind of have that role in your life, and you love them as much as if they were biologically related to you, possibly more. Who can say? So there is an element of the positive mother archetype being the kind of centrifugal force around which this family atmosphere radiates. But that's not what we're talking about. We're focusing on the dark side. That can be understood in a couple of ways, and some people, Maria von France and others, have distinguished between different parts of this sort of negative archetype, and distinguished into subsets, which are seen as related but not wholly overlapping, and we'll pick up on a little of that as we go along. So, broadly speaking, if we start with the Dark Mother, and then we'll move on to a subset which is sometimes referred to as the Death Mother, as a slightly different thing. The Dark Mother is smothering, overbearing, infantilizing of other people. So there's a mention, I'm sure we must have mentioned this before in previous podcasts, there was a comedy show on British television in I think it was the 90s, if I remember rightly, called Sorry, in which Ronnie Corbett played this timid little librarian who lived at home with his parents, and his father was this bit of a sort of bumbling old twit who didn't really do much and just background character, but the mother was extremely domineering, extremely overbearing, and even though her son Timothy was middle-aged when the program happened, she was still treating him as if he was sort of 5 years old. In fact, she treated pretty much everyone she met as if they were 5 years old. she'd become kind of fixated in this one narrow way of viewing the world, that she was the mother, everybody else therefore was a child and had to be treated accordingly, and a very small child, a dependent child, who could not be allowed to grow up. And so Timothy, say, even though he was a middle-aged man, was still living, almost behaving like a small child. He should get told off and sent to his room and nonsense like that, rather than acting as a mature adult. So he had not achieved independence from his mother. I suppose you could say, to some extent, not from his father either, but the mother was the sort of comedy focus of the show. There are, that's obviously, it's a caricature. Television, particularly comedies, work on caricatures, so it's a bit extreme. But there are, I am quite sure, not something I've got direct personal experience of, but I'm quite sure there are women out there, and indeed men out there, because worth bearing in mind that when Jung talks about the dark mother archetype, he's not confining it exclusively to women. He's saying that these archetypes exist in everybody. So a man can have a dark mother archetype, a woman could have a dark father archetype, and so on and so forth. And the positive archetypes likewise cross biological boundaries. So these are characteristics that can be expressed in someone regardless of whether they are male or female, or anything else for that matter. It might be more statistically common for the dark mother to be expressed by women than it is by men, and the dark father by men more statistically common than it is by women, but potentially it could manifest in anybody. So that's worth bearing in mind. But the point being, obviously in a healthy mother-child relationship, the children will grow up, they'll become more independent, they'll go off, they'll get homes of their own, get jobs, do this, do that. They'll be out in the world and they'll still be in contact with their mothers, and there'll be a loving relationship and all the rest of it, but they have transitioned from being children to being grown adults. And so the nature of the relationship between the mother and her adult children is different than the relationship between a mother and her small children. And that's normal, that's healthy. That would be the positive mother archetype. The dark mother archetype will not cut the apron strings, will not allow her children to grow up and move away from her. And there are all sorts of reasons why that might be, but a common one is that she, a bit like the mother in the comedy show, she is fixated on being this kind of one-note character. She doesn't know how to be anything other than a mother. So if her children do leave the house and move away and get jobs, go to university or whatever they're going to do, who would she be if she was sitting in a child-free house with no one to treat as if they were a small child? She might fear implosion, that she would lose her sense of identity. She would kind of crumble away into nothing. If I'm not this one thing, what am I? And a lot of people get that, not just about parenthood, but Jung and various other psychologists have noted that people who've spent all of their adult life in a particular job and they get to retirement age, they have this huge fear of, who will I be if I'm not a worker? If I'm not a doctor, a teacher, a carpenter, a bricklayer, or whatever it is that they are, that's what they have been for 20, 30, 40 years. And now they're facing the prospect of not being that. Some people might go, well, hey, looking forward to retirement, loving it. Other people might quake in their boots because they cannot imagine who on earth they would be if they're not being that thing anymore. So this isn't just confined to women getting to that kind of empty nest age where their children are of an age where they're about to go out into the big wide world and leave her behind, in a sense, or at least see a lot less of her at any rate. It's a phenomena found in other people in other ways too, but we'll focus on how it manifests in this sort of fear of letting go, fear of having to find a new identity, fear of who you would be if you were no longer a 24-hour-a-day mother. What would you be doing? Do you just kind of go out into the world and find a surrogate child and say, right, I'm adopting you, and you're going to fill the void left by my son or daughter who's moved out of the house? Do you evolve beyond and find and realise that as much as you loved being a mother, you can be other things too, and expand your identity in other ways, and sort of find fulfilment doing other stuff? A healthy person would go and do other stuff. An unhealthy person, somebody who's in a psychologically fragile state, might just fill the void either by acquiring another child, some random person they've adopted and pushed into the role of child, or by just refusing to allow their child to leave the house in the first place. Now, not many people are going to bolt the doors and confiscate their child's door key so they physically cannot leave the house. But they might, as per that comedy show, psychologically cripple their child so that they never have the sense of independence, a sense of self-confidence, the sense of curiosity about the world, the conviction that they can find love and start their own family and do this and do that and do the other, all the usual factors that lead a teenage child to want to leave home in the first place. All of that could be scuppered by lots of years worth of subtle undermining and kind of wheedling away into someone's psyche. And that's essentially what the Dark Mother does. It infantilizes the child by preventing the child from ever being anything other than an infant. So even when they're 20, 30, 40, whatever years old, they're still, up here at least, a dependent child, which is not a nice thing to do to somebody else, which is why as the Dark Mother, it's this destructive, overbearing archetype that kind of turns the apron strings into ball and chain, really. So the child almost becomes a slave to the mother, unable to get away from them, unable to have any independence from them. So it's quite a negative thing in a lot of ways. Now, having mentioned Marie from France, or Marie-Louise from France, I should say, she outlines this idea of the Death Mother. And she says it's not quite the same thing as the Dark Mother. Similar, but not quite the same thing. Now, a positive mother, even a dark mother, this sort of suffocating, overbearing presence, wants the child to live, to grow, to find happiness. Admittedly, the suffocating dark mother, that happiness has to be within her remit. They're not allowed to be happy somewhere else. They've got to be happy around her, but she still wants them to be happy. Whereas the Death Mother doesn't want the child in the first place. And that's the sort of the distinction between those two archetypes, that the Death Mother wishes the child was dead, wishes the child had never been born, which obviously we're getting into some quite dark territory here. Hopefully it's not going to give anyone nightmares and give them flashbacks to horrible experiences in their own lives. It's the infanticidal mother rather than the infantilizing mother. And that could be in a very literal way. Obviously there are women who do kill their children, who drown them in the bath or beat them to death or whatever it is that they do to them. Usually their own children, occasionally it's somebody else's child that they kill. Amelia Dwyer, back in the Victorian era, was an infamous baby farmer. For anyone who's unfamiliar with the notion of baby farming, back in the Victorian age, a lot of working class, sometimes lower middle class women would either get pregnant out of wedlock, or even if they were married, maybe they were in dire poverty. They were barely able to put food on the table. And in order to go on working at whatever low-paid jobs they could find, they had to choose between working and looking after their kids. So if they couldn't afford to look after their child, they would put the child with a baby farmer, and then they'd go back to work and try and put food on the table to keep body and soul together. Which sounds okay in and of itself, and most women in that situation assumed that their child was being looked after. Obviously they had visitation rights. This isn't quite babysitting. It's not just that the baby farmer would look after the kid during working hours. They would look after them pretty much permanently for years on end, until the mother was in a better financial position to take the child back. Now, the baby farmer clearly had to be paid. They weren't doing this out of love. This was a form of employment. And they'd have 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, however many kids they'd look after. And all the various mothers and fathers would be paying for the child to be looked after. And I'd assume in most cases, I don't know what the statistics are in this, but presumably, in order for them to stay in business, most baby farmers would have done a reasonably good job. They'd have fed the kids, changed their nappies, looked after them, eventually handed them back more or less intact to the parents. But Amelia Dwyer would murder the children in her care. And when the mothers turned up for their weekly visits, or however often they were allowed to see the child, she'd always have an excuse. Oh, little Johnny is too sick, they've got the croup, you'll have to come back next week. Obviously, the mothers could only be put off so many times before they'd start to think to themselves, there's something seriously wrong here, this woman is lying through her back teeth. When those fretful mothers would start to get panicked, and obviously the next step would be to go to the police, Amelia Dwyer would skip town. And she did this no end of times. Now, eventually, without getting too graphic, the body of an infant was found floating in a river, wrapped up in brown paper, and with a cord around the baby's neck, where it had been strangled to death. Now, for reasons best known to a psychiatrist, Amelia Dwyer, when she lobbed this poor child into a river, had wrapped it up in a bit of brown paper that had entered her house, covering a parcel given to her by the postman with her name and address on it. Never seems to have occurred to Amelia Dwyer that somebody might find the body with the name and address still on the bit of brown paper. Possibly because she had murdered so many kids by this point in time that she believed herself, as a lot of career criminals do, to be uncatchable. But somebody did find the body, and the address was there, and it was obviously the baby was murdered, and the police turned up at the door and gave her a good old truncheoning and put her on trial, and eventually she was hanged. Now, she was hanged for one murder, that poor baby in the river, but it was widely believed when this came to light, and lots of women came forward and said, oh, she used to look after my child and I never saw my child ever again. That in the course of her many years of baby farming, skipping from town to town, that she had probably murdered something in the region of 400 babies. Murdered them for money. So kill off the kid, take money from the parents for several more weeks whilst they naively thought their child was still alive, and spend the money on whatever she wanted to spend the money on, profit from it, and then eventually skip town. So a fairly horrific case. So that would be the death mother image. A woman who is meant to look after a child and nurture it and love it and care for it, who in fact kills the child. There have been other, somewhat less extreme in terms of the scale of murders, but there have been lots of other cases of people in caring professions, babysitters, nurses, all sorts of women in caring positions where they're meant to be looking after somebody else's child, and in fact have just murdered the child. So that, as a notion, this kind of death mother crops up in reality. It also, as Jung, as a lover of myth and fairy tale and works of fiction and so on, would have pointed out, crops up in a lot of works of fiction. A fairly prominent example, almost everyone is going to know about, is the story of Hansel and Gretel, who make it through the woods and see the witch's cottage made out of gingerbread and sweets and all sorts of things, and the supposedly nice old lady who lives there takes them in and very rapidly bungs them in a cage and then fattens them up, because she intends to kill them and eat them when they're nice and chubby, and presumably self-basting. Obviously they escape, but partly it's a recollection of earlier centuries where children would be abandoned, periods of hunger, and some people did cannibalise abandoned children because they themselves were on the edge of starvation, and so turning to cannibalism it's easier to kill an abandoned child and eat them than it is to kill your next door neighbour who might be taller than you are and eat them. So it's gruesome and horrible, but it's the kind of thing people do in dire straits of survival. One of the Hannibal Lecter books details a crime of that nature, of people in a war-torn country where they're all on the edge of starvation and a child is killed and eaten to ward off starvation. And that's supposedly how Hannibal Lecter gets his cannibalistic kind of appetites, from this horrific experience that happens to him when he is still very young. And that's an element to kind of mull over, the whether it's the Death Mother or the Dark Mother, when they are acting out these traits towards another human being. So it's no longer just myths and fairy tales and films and whatnot, but real life stuff can cause horrific long-term psychological, sometimes physical damage to other people. Either they, like Dwyer, they murder them, or even if they don't murder them, a lifetime of cruelty and abuse and vindictive ranting and raving about, I never wanted you in the first place, you're an awful child, you're a horrible child. Any kid growing up listening to that on a regular basis is going to end up as a psychologically, emotionally scarred adult, with perhaps a lifetime of therapy ahead of them. So as an archetype, it can cause a hell of a lot of damage to people around it. And it, as various commentators and writers have commented, Dorothy Block was one of the therapists who commented on this. The Death Mother goes against the grain of what is expected in almost all societies of women. In pretty much it, difficult to think of a society that doesn't do this, actually. So I'm going to say almost every society, on the basis that there might be a society I've never heard of that doesn't do this, but certainly the ones I've heard of do. So almost every society expects women, when they become mothers, to be nurturing and caring and kind. And it likewise, the assumption is that when a young girl becomes a sister, she will be kind towards her baby brother or baby sister. Aunties will be kind and caring. Grandmothers will be kind and caring. Women in a professional role of looking after children will be kind and caring. A kind of an innate maternal nurturing quality comes to the fore. And quite what the statistics are, I don't know, but I would guess the fact that the human race is still alive after 100,000 years probably means that generally speaking is true more often than not. That the vast majority of women are quite caring and nurturing, and the kind of stereotypical thing that someone's pushing their baby in a pram through the park, lots of other women come up and google and gurgle and peer into the pram and say, oh, how lovely. You don't normally see a bunch of blokes going up to a pram and going, oh, how lovely, and gooing and gurgling and what have you over the baby. It tends to be more of a stereotypically female response than a male response. So it seems a fair assumption, at risk of stereotyping, that probably the majority of women are quite maternal. Not everyone, clearly, but the majority. But some are not. Some are just indifferent. They look at a baby and go, yeah, and move on. They maybe are more sympathetic to kittens or puppies or whatever, but they don't feel much. They're just kind of indifferent, a bit the way I am. I look at a baby and it's a baby. I've got no urge to Google and gurgle and make silly noises to a baby. It's kind of, that's the parents to do. I'll just kind of, it doesn't interest me. So some women have that response. Others have a much more brutal response. And the Death Mother, is not just indifference, it's outright hostility. It's someone who looks at a dependent infant. What comes to their heart is not boredom and indifference, but rage. It's an urge to put a pillow over the child's face or strangle it or whatever, chuck it out the window, to get rid of that child in some overtly hostile fashion. And as already mentioned, some do, but others don't actually kill their child. They don't want to go to prison, so they don't actually kill their child, but they make it known to the child over the course of its lifetime that the child is not wanted. It may be they say outright, I don't want you, you're horrible, I wish you'd never been born. It may be that they don't say it, but their actions, their coldness, their hostility, their anger implies clearly to the child that they were never wanted in the first place. And so even if it's never outright said, the child knows that they are, in the eyes of their mother, nothing but a nuisance. Now, one element that Daniela Sheff picks up, I think I've said her surname rightly, is that if we're thinking globally around the world today, in a lot of very poor countries, and historically in the rich West, go back into the past when the West wasn't so rich, there's going to be an awful lot of people, millions and millions and millions and millions of people, who can barely afford to feed themselves. And they have one child too many, as it were, one child more than their very limited finances will stretch to. They may not outright hate the child or anything as melodramatic as that, but it's a mouth more than they can afford to feed. And deep down they wish that child hadn't been born. They were just about struggling to keep food on the table for their existing kids, but now here's one more, two more, three more, four more than they can manage. And they're maybe exhausted trying to make ends meet, slogging their guts out in a low-paid job, grubbing around to find food, let alone clothes, let alone books, let alone toys, let alone whatever else the kid may need. And so a lot of children are going to grow up knowing, from their own lived experience, that their parents couldn't cope with them, couldn't afford. They were struggling to feed them, that knowing that they were in effect a burden. The parent may have done their best to try and be loving to the child, but the child has realised, children do very quickly, that their existence is a burden on their parents. And so the child may internalise that. They may hate the parent, resent the parent, think, well, why didn't you work harder? Why didn't you find more money falling out the sky? It's your fault you had me. You should have not had me in the first place. All this kind of thing. So some externalise and rage against the parent. Some internalise and accept that the world would have been better off, mum and dad would have been better off had I never been born. And they may go through life feeling like someone who shouldn't really be here. No matter what they achieve, no matter what they do, how good they are, how kind they are, how popular they are, deep down they keep thinking, I don't deserve to be here, I shouldn't be here, I'm just a dead weight, I'm a pain in the bum to everyone else, I'm a burden, the world would be better off without me. And one day maybe they go and lob themselves off a bridge and put that into action. Or they drink themselves to death, drug themselves to death, whatever kind of forms of slow suicide that people engage in. So again, the internalised scars of the death mother. And this, in the interests of equality, could also be a death father, because just as there are mothers who can't afford to feed their kids, there are clearly just as many fathers who can't afford to feed their kids and maybe wish that little Susie hadn't been born and all the rest of it. So this could be coming from a father as well as or instead of a mother. But we're focusing on the mother for today. So there's that sort of consciousness of not being wanted is scarring to the child, and scarring arguably to the mother themselves, who's got to scrimp and scrape and save and do Lord knows what else to try and feed this child they don't really want, this child who feels to them like a dead weight, something that they could well do without. And whatever, perhaps the majority of parents think, well, yes, my child does cost a lot of money, but they're kind and they're loving and they're this and they're that and they're the other. There's all these nice things that come from my child, as well as the bills that have to be paid for the child. But the death mother doesn't see the nice things. They just see the bills, the burdens, the duties, when they'd sooner be out partying, whatever they'd sooner be out doing, and they've got to be home changing nappies and helping the kid with their homework and doing all these boring things that they don't want to do. They see the downside of the child. They don't see the upside of the child. And the child becomes acutely aware of that fact. So that's a sort of a difficult relationship. Something else that Chef picks up on, and historians often talk about this kind of concept of dark parenting, that again, many parts of the world today, the poorer parts of the world, and historically in the richer parts of the world back when they weren't rich, people tended to have big families. They might have 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 kids, more than that maybe. Often on the basis that for the vast majority of people, a sizable number of their children would not live to adulthood. So you had 8 kids and you thought, well, maybe 3 of them will make it to adulthood. The other 5 will die. Diseases, poverty, starvation, war, whatever. If you're in that situation as a parent, Chef and a variety of historians argue, let's say you have buried 4 children. They've succumbed to disease, they've succumbed to starvation, and so on. We're not talking murder here, just kind of life's vicissitudes have happened. You've lost 4 kids, 5 kids, 6 kids. The first child that dies is a horrific trauma, and probably the second, probably third. But does there come a point, therapists ask, historians ask, does there come a point where you've seen so much death happening to the people you love that you go numb? The only way you can survive is to turn off. Is to stop caring. Oh, it's another child, all right, well, maybe you'll live, maybe you won't, whatever. So you don't attach to the subsequent children in the same way, because it's an emotional investment you're no longer willing to make, because you don't know how long that kid's going to live. In some societies, there are traditions about naming a baby. Well, pretty much all societies have traditions about naming a baby, but in some of them, there is a fixed time at which the baby is named, so many days after birth. Up until that point, the baby has no name. Now, maybe mum and dad have already decided the name they want to give, but officially the baby does not have a name until that ceremony takes place. One of the reasons for this is the sheer volume of babies who died very, very quickly after birth from diseases and so forth. And the notion was that there wasn't, without wishing to be brutal, there wasn't much point naming the child and emotionally investing in that child until they'd survived a certain period of time, after which you could think, yeah, well, they've made it through a week, 2 weeks, they'll probably live. Now we'll give it a name. Now we'll start investing in the kid, emotionally investing in the child. So for that first window period, which is when these days we tend to think, mothers bonding with their babies and oxytocin flooding their brain and their, all of that. In a lot of cultures, there's no expectation of that. Obviously, the child has to be fed and its nappy changed and all that palaver, but you don't invest in the child enough to even give it a name until it's survived a certain period of time. It's a horrible reality of just how harsh life has been for billions of people around the world for umpty thousand years. That many of them, probably the vast majority of them, would have lost children, and a lot of those children would have been lost in infancy. They wouldn't even have lived to be 5 years old, 10 years old, 15 years old. They'd have died in the first few weeks of life because of all the diseases and problems that beset the world in earlier centuries. Steven Pinker points out that with each year that rolls past, the percentage of the planet that has these problems gets smaller and smaller as more and more countries get a little bit richer and a little bit richer and a little bit richer, and their healthcare gets better and food provision gets better, and the number of people having to face these horrors gets smaller and smaller. So the percentage of the world facing these horrors in 2024 is way smaller than it was in 1924, which was smaller than 1824, which was smaller than 1724. So it is gradually decreasing over the passage of time, which is a good thing. Now, returning to stories and fiction and mythological dramas and so forth, in Jewish tradition there is the notion of Lilith. Lilith is, for anyone unfamiliar, the first wife of Adam, as in Adam and Eve. So before Eve there was Lilith. And for various reasons, which we can park to one side, and we can always discuss them in the group meeting at the end of the month if anyone's interested. Things don't go well between Lilith and Adam. She won't do as she's told. Adam is expected to be the sort of macho man laying down the law, and Lilith won't have any of it. So eventually she is cast out of the Garden of Eden, and she goes off, and it refers to her consorting with demons. So even then there were demons hanging around, and she consorts with demons, and she gives birth to monster children. The Lilim are her monster children, so kind of half human-like from their mother, and half demonic monster thing from their assorted fathers. And these Lilim spread throughout the world. And one of the things that the Lilim do, and Lilith herself does, is to break into nurseries and hover over very small children and suck the life out of them. Now, at a prosaic level, it's one way of explaining things like cot death, when you don't have the scientific understanding of what cot death is. So you say, oh, well, some scary demon thing came in the night and killed my newborn child. It's a way of understanding it, but it's also a representation of this death mother. So Lilith is the death mother, the maternal figure who dualistically is both a death mother and a dark mother. In the death mother side, she breaks into people's houses and kills their children. The dark mother is that she is the mother of this monster brood of the Lilim. And there are various figures from mythology of monster families in which there is a matriarchal figure who gives birth to all of the horrible, scary monsters that bedevil the world, and maybe loves and cares for those horrible, scary monsters, but unleashes them on the world. So the Dark Mother can be understood not only in terms of maybe being like a bad, neglectful, abusive mother, but also even where it's nurturing of monsters. And at a human level, you've got characters like Ma Barker, who back in the 1920s led a crime family, well, allegedly led, there's a bit of a dispute of this with historians, but allegedly led a crime family of her sons and her husband and a few other hangers-on, who would go around robbing post offices and robbing banks and all sorts. So she was often kind of visualised as this gangster, matriarchal gangster sending her sons out to rob banks and whatnot. And eventually the FBI caught up with them, and there was a big shootout, and she died and their sons died, and all sorts of melodrama going on. But for a while she was on wanted posters all over America saying Ma Barker, head of the Barker gang. And instead of being seen as this sort of put upon figure, she was seen as a villain. So you could contrast that to somebody like Violet Cray. Was it Violet? I think it was Violet. Mother of the Cray twins, who was never directly involved in any of their crimes. She didn't commit the crimes, she didn't plan the crimes, she gave birth to horrible psychopaths, but was not herself portrayed in the media or widely believed by the police to have any involvement in the crimes, aside presumably from profiting from them financially. If Ronnie and Reggie bought her a nice new coat, or bought her a new sofa, or whatever they bought her with the ill-gotten gains from their criminal activities, I'm sure she was financially well looked after, but she wasn't a direct participant, whereas Ma Barker was allegedly a direct. I say allegedly because there is some dispute as to whether she was quite as involved as was widely believed. That possibly she wasn't quite that involved, but that's a moot point. Popular understandings of the situation have it that she was a gang matriarch running the sort of villainous side, like a kind of female version of the Godfather, that kind of thing, which would be an example of the Dark Father, the Godfather, the mafiosi Godfather. So there's that sort of notion of the mother of monsters comes under the Dark Mother. In Irish myth, you've got the Tuatha Dé Danann, the gods of the Earth Mother Danu, who's the positive version. And then you have the Tuatha Dé Domnú, the Vomorians, the sort of sea monsters who live in the very depths of the ocean, whose matriarch is Domnú, the goddess of the abyss, the goddess of the dark depths. And so Domnu and Danu are two sides of a coin, the positive side and the negative side. The mother of monsters, the mother of gods. And a fair number of myths have a sort of mother of monsters type figure. Spawning all sorts of evil, warped, twisted children who go around killing and maiming and doing horrific things in the world. So there is an element of that going on there. Medea would be another figure to mention in Greek myth, who falls madly in love with Jason, and then Jason treats her crappily. By this point in the story, she and Jason have had children, several children, and she pursues in a ship, trying to catch up with Jason, who's jumped aboard another ship and legged it and tried to escape her attentions. And eventually, when she realises she's never going to get Jason back, she murders her own children, his children, as a way of getting back at Jason. And there have been actual crimes like that, where a scorned parent has murdered the children of the other parent that has done the scorning, even if they were their own children too. It's a way of getting back at the other parent by murdering your own kids. It's quite horrific. But that is an example of the death mother. The mother for whom the children are just pawns in a game to be used and, if necessary, discarded, destroyed. There's no real love or affection or care or nurture. They're just a means to an end. Very Kantian. Immanuel Kant argued that you can either value people in and of themselves, if you're a decent human being, or, if you're not a decent human being, you treat people as a means to an end. You use them, and when they're no longer of use to you, you chuck them away. Sometimes, in Medea's case, you sort of terminally chuck them away, and they're over and done with, and that's the end of it. Pushy stage mothers would count as that sort of usage and abusage, where the child is pressurised to become a singer, a dancer, an actor, or whatever it is that they want the kid to be. And they push and push and push, and the child is miserable as sin, but the mother is determined you will be successful, and becomes this kind of driving force that pushes and pushes and pushes, no matter how much harm is done to the child, in the mother's relentless pursuit of living out her fantasies. Because she is the failed actress, the failed singer, or whatever, and the kid will be made to compensate the mother for the abandoned dreams of fame and fabulosity. I didn't realise I've kind of waffled on quite a bit on this. So I think we'll draw it to a close there, and we've covered a fair number of aspects of this sort of dark mother archetype in both the actual day-to-day world and in stories and myth and cinema and so on. Hopefully it's conveyed enough of an understanding, but to sort of draw it to some kind of a conclusion, the argument from Jung, Marie-Louise from France, and a bunch of other people, Daniela Chef and so on, is that we have both sides in ourselves, the positive and the negative, the light and the dark. And whilst embracing the dark side does not mean you have to go around battering your kids or murdering them or do anything equally horrific and dreadful, you nonetheless own the emotions. The only way to achieve wholeness is to own that sometimes you don't like your kids very much. Sometimes they annoy the hell out of you. They go on and on and on, and you want to boot them up the bum. It doesn't mean you have to go and do that, but you have to admit to having the feelings, the emotions. You don't necessarily have to admit it to the kid. They don't need to know that. But to yourself, that you have these dark impulses. Maybe there are days when you wish to yourself that you didn't have kids and you could be off doing whatever it is that you would be doing without them. Or maybe, like the mother of monsters, you admit to yourself that your kids are pretty bloody awful. That you've raised these kids and they're off making everybody else's lives miserable because they're nasty little buggers, and that you have become a mother of monsters. Maybe your kids aren't the sweet, perfect, lovely little darlings that you kid on to yourself that they are. And that actually your children are the Cray twins. But the path to therapy is owning that, and it's only by owning it that you begin to heal. and you begin to stop inflicting wounds on other people on the basis that people who are hurting go on to hurt others. So if you stop hurting in yourself, you will hopefully stop going around inflicting hurt and misery on other people. So that's the path towards wholeness. But we'll leave it there and look forward to discussing the Suffolk Jungian Circle. And if anyone who's not in the circle is listening, by all means, leave a comment, a thought, a reflection. We can bounce ideas back and forth. Thank you.